In 1959 and 1964, when I was in high school, secondary school, every summer vacation I spent all of my vacation in the parts of Ireland in which Irish was still the mother tongue, what we call the Gaeltacht, particularly the Gaeltacht areas of West Cork and Kerry, down around Doonqueen and Doonmoy, where Bruce and Steve spent a lot of time. And there I met a whole bunch of other great storytellers. And I spent summer holidays collecting stories and collecting proverbs. In Irish we call them Shanachel, literally ancient words. And I collected 432 proverbs one year. I remember the number very well because it was the year St. Patrick came to Ireland, 432. So I found out that the distillation of the wisdom of any culture can be found in their proverbs. And if you want an extended, entertained version of the proverbs, go to the stories. The stories are the distillation of the culture's wisdom. So I collected a lot of those stories between 1959 and 1964. But in 1969, I was in the seminary, I'd been halfway through my studies in the seminary. I came across probably the most famous of all of the Irish storytellers. He was born in 1899, and he was the first professor of Irish folklore at the University College of Dublin, a guy called Seamus Novelego. And he come roughly from Mary's part of the country. He was born in Cushendall in County Antrim in the northeast of the country, and then emigrated to Dublin at some stage. But in 1935, Seamus Novelego had founded the Irish Folklore Commission. And he trained the primary school teachers of Ireland to teach the kids how to go into the villages and collect the folklore from their grandfathers and grandmothers. And over a period of about 2 or 3 decades, they collected, the Irish Folklore Commission, 1.5 million manuscripts of folklore. It is the largest collection of folklore anywhere in the world, due mainly to the working of this extraordinary genius, whom I befriended. I was a good friend of his for several years before I went to Africa, Seamus Novelego. So one of the things I found out about stories is that if you want to know the culture of people, that's the place to go. And I thought for a while that maybe the Irish might have been the first storytellers. I got disabused of that very, very quickly. Unfortunately, the Irish were not the first storytellers. Maybe the best storytellers, but not the first. That honour goes way, way back, almost 3.7 billion years. Because the first storytellers on planet Earth were the bacteria, the first life form on the planet. Bacteria learned how to adapt to their environment and record their impressions so that they could live in any kind of a situation. And when new bacteria would swim into an area, the other bacteria would share their stories with them to give them a kind of a head up for survival. So bacteria were the first storytellers and the first archivists of story. And in fact, they created the first great work project. We call it, in modern times, we call it evolution. Everything that exists on the planet right now had its beginnings with the bacteria. And so, as human beings, as we begin to trace our history, we have a total archive of the entire journey, courtesy of the bacteria within us. And just in case we're careless and we might happen to lose a copy, they give us about 50 trillion copies each. There's a copy of it in every single cell of your body, 50 trillion of them. And
right back to
if you can't hear me, just make it up. So once human beings arrived on the scene, Homo sapiens sapiens particularly, which is only about 50,000 years ago. Is there a big echo? It sounds like there's an echo.
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
It's worse.
No. Better. Okay. So you can hear me, but I can't hear myself. It's a distinct advantage. So once Homo sapiens sapiens got into the act, and Homo sapiens sapiens, as distinct from Homo sapiens, only arrived on the scene about 50,000 years ago. Homo sapiens sapiens is that group of hominids who learned how to think about thinking. They developed language. And with the advent of language, there was the advent of storytelling among human beings. And we told, it seems to me, 4 different kinds of stories. The first story each one of us begins to tell is my story. I pick out those group of experiences that seem to define who I think I am. So my identity, basically, is the stories I tell myself about myself. That's the first group of stories. And then there's a second group of stories, which was the stories that the tribe told themselves about themselves. And this we call history. So history is just that particular group of stories that a tribe will tell themselves about themselves. And then the third kind of stories we tell, we call it theology. It's the stories we tell about the relationships between ourselves and the gods. And there's just another group of stories, but it defines our relationship with them. And then the fourth group of stories, maybe the most important of all, we call it cosmology. It's the stories we tell about the origins of the universe and our relationship to the universe. So in the course of time, stories have proved really, really, really important. When Homo sapiens sapiens evolved 50,000 years ago, the average life expectancy was in the late teens and early 20s. And so it became very, very important to not have to reinvent the wheel again and again and again and again. So we passed on our wisdom. As teenagers and as young adults, we passed it on to the next generation so the wisdom would not be lost. So that was the first function of it, in a sense. And then we began to use stories as a form of entertainment. But I believe that the most important function of all of story is not education, it's not passing on tradition, it's not even entertainment, although it does all of those things. It is that storytelling, in my opinion, was the first practice where humans learned to volitionally shift states of consciousness. It was the first time they volitionally could do it. They could shift states of consciousness by telling different kinds of stories. And that, for me, is the greatest gift of all of our stories and our storytelling. Because it is only by shifting states of consciousness that we can access the other levels of reality. There are many, 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 there's a myriad of levels of reality folded into each other, just like the radio waves going through this room right now. If we had a radio, we could tune into any one we wanted. But we don't have a radio, thanks for the guide, and so it's going through and we can't interpret it. So reality is like that. Reality exists in a myriad of forms, all embedded in each other. And storytelling is one of the ways we've figured out how to fine-tune the antenna so we can access different states of consciousness and therefore have encounters with different levels of reality. And when you learn how to do that, you have real encounters with real entities and real energies. Leprechauns and fairies, the ones that Mary was telling about tonight, they are totally real. But they do not exist in this particular state of consciousness. Only when we shift our state of consciousness do we have access to those very real denizens of the other dimensions. And if we are serious about the trajectory of our evolutionary journey, we need to know how to gain access to those places. So we developed other methods subsequently, like music, meditation, fasting. But the very first one, and the one over which we have total control, is to tell stories. It shifts our state of consciousness. So I'm hoping that tonight, that as you're listening to Steve and Bruce and Mary with their music and their stories, and as you listen as I speak, that you're not just here to be entertained. It's nice to be entertained. But I would really, really invite you to mind what Mary has said to us tonight, and to mind the music that you're listening to tonight, for the states of consciousness that allow you access to different levels of reality so you can have real encounters with the denizens of those realms. And that's what I'll be attempting to do for the next hour. With a whole bunch of different kinds of stories, I'm going to invite you into different states of consciousness that give you access to different levels of reality. A culture without storytelling is an evolutionary cul-de-sac. And a species without a story is an evolutionary cul-de-sac. And it's the danger of our times. There are fewer and fewer stories being told on our planet, and so we have access to less and less levels of consciousness, and therefore to different levels of reality. So open yourself up to the evolutionary trajectory, do yourself a gift, and let your mind and your imagination take you where perhaps intellect cannot. So then it makes a whole bunch of stories. The Celts were not the first people to live in Ireland, not by a long shot. Before that, you had other groups. You had the Fomorians, you had the Filbog, and you had the Milesians, and away before those, you had a group, a very extraordinary group called, in Irish they call them the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Dana. But when the Milesians came to Ireland, there was a pitched battle, 2 pitched battles in fact, at a place called Moytura. And there was 2 battles between the Milesians, newly arrived, and the Tuatha Dé Danann, who had been there since the fall of Atlantis, thousands of years before. And in these 2 pitched battles, the Milesians won out. And I have kind of a theory that the Milesians may have had iron tools, which is when Mary told us that to set somebody free from the fairy grape you needed some kind of iron tool. So the Milesians may well have had iron weaponry which allowed them to defeat the Tuatha Dé Danann. But they did. And so there was an agreement made between the 2 of them that they would divide the land of Ireland in equal halves between the Milesians and the Tuatha Dé Danann. But it wasn't like they drew a line across the country and one group got the north and the other got the south. It was a different kind of a line. They drew a line on the earth and they said, the Milesians will occupy and own and rule Ireland above, on the land and above it. And the Tuatha Dé Danann will rule and occupy the land below it. And so the Tuatha Dé Danann shape-shifted and they began to live in the hills and the mountains and underground, where they built extraordinary cities and palaces and developed all kinds of art forms and music. And that was the agreement between them. The Milesians had the above ground, the upper kingdom, if you want to call it that, and the Tuatha Dé Danann had the lower kingdom, and they had to shape-shift in order to be citizens of that arena. So I'm going to tell you the first story from that time. One of the kings of the Tuatha Dé Danann was a guy called Midir. And at that time, polygamy was practiced among the Tuatha Dé Danann. A man could have several wives. So Midir had a wife whose name was Fuamnach. And after a few years, he clapped his eyes on a very beautiful young girl called Etain. And Etain was the most beautiful woman in the Tuatha Dé Danann kingdom. In fact, it became kind of a saying afterwards when you were talking about the beautiful woman, would say she was as beautiful as Etain. So Etain was the standard for beauty among the Tuatha Dé Danann. So he wooed her, and he married her, and he brought her home to the missus. And Fuamnach was not impressed. She was not a happy camper. So she put up with it for about a year, but then at one stage, she went to a druid and she asked if she could get some kind of a magic formula with her hazel wand to do a number on Etain. And they consulted together and they put the spell on Etain and they turned her into a butterfly. And then they called up this extraordinary tempest and they blew her away from her home. And she's been battling the wind and has no idea where she's going. She's been in total tumult in the wind. And finally, by good luck, she lands in the dune of Aengus Og. And Aengus Og is the Irish god of love. And Aengus Og lived in Bruna Boyne, which is near the present-day Boyne, near County Dublin. And he was the Irish god of love. And it was said that there were 4 birds that flew around his head constantly singing. And if anybody heard that music, they fell instantly in love. So good luck, Etain was blown into his window. And because Aengus was a god figure himself and one of the Tuatha Dé Danann, he recognized her, even in her shape-shifted form. And so he gave her a place to stay. And in fact, he built a beautiful kind of a summer retreat for her with all kinds of flowers where she could drink the honey and land on the flowers all day long. She was happy enough there for several years. But in the meantime, Midir is tearing his hair out. He has no idea what's happened. He's not aware of what Fuamnach has done. And he's searching all over fairyland for his beloved, and he can't find her. And finally, Fuamnach is aware that at some stage he might happen upon her, so she decides that she wants to drive Etain out of Aengus Og's territory. So she consults with her druid again, and they bring up this fierce tempest from Dublin Bay, and it totally destroys where Etain is, and she's blown across, and she's blown totally out of fairyland into the world of humans, into the world of the Milesians. And she's buffeted by this wind and this torrential rain, and her wings are just barely able to flap, And she finds herself in front of this big, big house, and she flies in through an open window and lands on a rafter. And down below her, she suddenly realises she's in the banquet hall of the King of Leinster. And there's a big banquet going on below them, and all the chieftains and warriors and women are sitting at table drinking their meal. And she's landed up in this rafter, but she's so tired that she can barely hold her balance. Now the Queen of Leinster at the time had no children. She was married for about 10 years, but she had no children. She dearly longed for a child, but she couldn't have a child. And so there is Etain, barely trying to hold her balance, and all of a sudden she can't keep her eyes closed anymore. She falls off the beam, and the Queen is drinking a goblet of mead, wine, right down below, and Etain falls right down into it. And the Queen is already in her cup, she doesn't notice. The Queen takes a slow. Feels really good. Lo and behold, 9 months later, she gives birth to a baby girl, and everybody is delighted for her. And so they're trying to figure out what are they going to call her. And the daddy wants to call her one thing after his grandmother, and somebody else wants to call her something else. No, she says, I was told in a dream that this little girl is to be called Etain. And the king said, there's nobody in our family called Etain, it's not even a human name. God's name, why she picked on. She says, no, I was told in a dream this little girl is to be called Etain. So she lands with the same name again. But now she's born in human form. And she has no recollection whatsoever that she belongs to the Tuatha Dé Danann. And so she grows up to be this really beautiful girl, as beautiful now as she was then. And at this stage, around this period of time, the High King of Ireland, his wife died, and he was in mourning. And every year there was a big feast day on the hill of Tara, which is where the High King lived. And all the nobles of Ireland and all the kings of Ireland and the women would gather, and there'd be games and jousting and storytelling and music of all kinds that would go on all week long. So the elders sent a message to the king, High King, saying, we're not going to come to Tara this year with our wives, because we know about you, and if you don't have a wife of your own, you'll be clapping eyes on one of ours. So get a wife for yourself, or we won't be turning up this year to Tara. So we sent embassies around Ireland to find out, who was the most beautiful girl that he could marry. And immediately the message came back, it's Etain, the daughter of the King of Leinster. So the match was made, and they were to get married. So there was going to be a big feast lasting the whole week, and at the end of the week, they were going to get married. And all the nobles are beginning to gather in. And then the days leading up to it, Etain is out with some of her girlfriends, and they're walking in the meadows, and all of a sudden she sees this rider coming towards her on this beautiful white stallion. And this is obviously some kind of prince. He's got long, flowing blonde hair and blue eyes, and this purple cloak that's flowing in the wind behind him. And for some strange reason, none of her handmaidens can see him. Only Etain can see him. And he comes right up to her and he says, my beloved, do you not recognize me? And she has no idea who this guy is. She said, I don't know you. And he said, I'm your husband, I'm Midr. I want you to come back to the land of Tuatha Dé Danann with me. She said, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know anything about the Tuatha Dé Danann. I'm getting married in a week time to the High King of Ireland. So he could see that his case was lost. So he turned around in his charger and rode back out. But in the course of the week, as the jousting is continuing and people are telling stories and doing music and having feasts and whatever, all of a sudden he comes back again. And he stands right in front of the High King of Ireland. Now, it's a little known fact that the Irish, way back, were great chess players. It's called Cleithfeala. The Irish term for playing chess is Cleithfeala. So this warrior comes up with the golden hair and the blue eyes, and comes off his horse, and he comes up to the king and he said, I believe that you are the chess champion of Ireland. And the High King said, I am. And Midr, because it was he, said to him, I challenge you to 3 games of chess, and there'll be a reward for each game. And the High King said, fine. And they sat down at the chessboard, and Midr took out a beautiful chessboard, really ornate, with diamond pieces. And they put their pieces on the board, and everybody gathered round because the king was the known champion in Ireland. And they played in 4 hours to finish the first game, and the High King won it. And then they said, okay, name your price. And the High King said, I see on your horse you've got saddlebags. I want you to give me the fill of one of your saddlebags of silver. And Midr goes back to his steed, stands stood in front of it, nobody can see what he was doing, and he comes back and lands a bag of silver right down in front of the king. He says, open it. And he opened it up, it was pure silver. So So he said, okay, let's play the second game. So they started the second game, and the second game lasted about 7 hours. It was tit for tat all the way, and finally the High King won the second game. And the other said, name your price. And the High King said, I want you from your other side of the line to give me the fill of it in gold. So Miller goes back to his team, and he's standing in front of the horse, and I can't see what he's doing. He comes back with a bag of gold, puts it down, he says, open it up, and it's full of gold. And Miller says, okay, I challenge you to the third game. And they played the third game, and it lasted all night into the dawn, and Miller won the third game. And the High King was devastated. He'd never been beaten before, and in front of all the nobles, he was really, really embarrassed. So he said, okay, name your price. And Miller says, very simple. I want a single kiss from Etienne. And the king was infuriated. He said, he's looking around, but he can't break his word. Everybody's watching. He's lost the game, he has to honor it. So he said to him, come back in a month's time, and I grant your wish. So in the meantime, he gathers all the troops, all his warriors from all over Ireland, and he rings the entire fort and the hill of Tara, which is layer upon layer upon layer of warriors. And inside the big banquet hall, there are concentric circles of the best warriors he could find. And exactly a month later, they're sitting down at the banquet table, himself and his wife, Etienne, just newly married, just that very, very day. And along comes the prince, the long, flowing white hair, and the blue eyes, and the flowing cape. He comes up and he said, I've come to claim my prize, a kiss from Etienne. And the king opens up the ranks, and allow him through, and they close ranks again. And the king says to him, remember, you've got one kiss, and that's it. And at this stage, Etienne had been having dreams for the entire month, and she had recollected and remembered completely that she was indeed of the Tuatha De Danann, and that this indeed had been her husband. And so he comes, breaks into the circle, and Etienne is released from the banquet table, and she comes down to him, he puts her arms around her, and the two of them start to kiss, and all of a sudden there's this flash of lightning, and the whole place goes into darkness, and all the lamps and all the candles go out, and there's pandemonium, and there's rattling of swords, and they're rushing about, they're trying to light all the candles again, and Etienne and Miller are gone. And they rush outside, and the warriors haven't broken this, nothing has come out here. And they look in the night sky, and all they can see is two white swans circling high above them in the star-studded night sky. So these two had lived on them, they shape-shifted, and their names got changed, and Mary has already told you much about them. In Ireland then we know them as the Slua She, the fairy host. And exactly as you said, the Irish people had this really, really tentative relationship with the Slua She. Very, very fearful of them, and fascinated by them at the same time. And so like she said, we have many, many different names for them. The little people, or the wee folk, or the gentle folk, or, you know, you never call them the fairies. You wouldn't say that word exactly for the reasons she said, in case they'd curse you. If you're really, really careful, because if you, for instance, built your house on what was a fairy path, you'd have endless kind of poltergeist-type activity happening non-stop. So be really, really careful. And they were great shapeshifters and tricksters as well. And so you have to be really, really careful about blundering into it. And exactly as she said, there were some of them that specialized in seducing young men. So there's another great song that comes from her own area, up in County Donegal, a place called the Rosses. And this one is in English, I'll sing it for you. And it was my father's favourite song. And it's a story exactly about a young man who was seduced by a fairy girl and was left heartbroken. And is afraid that not only having lost his heart, he's going to lose his soul as well. So it goes like this. By the shortcut to the Rosses, a fairy girl I met. I was taken by her beauty, as a fish is in a net. The fellow unfurled to look at her, so very fair was she, with her hair as bright as seaweed that floats in from the deep. By the shortcut to the Rosses, 'twas on the 1st of May, I heard the fairies piping, and they piped my heart away. They piped till I was mad with joy, and when I was alone, I found they piped my heart away, and in my breast a stone. By the shortcut to the Rosses, 'tis I'll go nevermore, lest she should also steal my soul, who stole my heart before, lest she steal my soul and crush it like a dead leaf in her hand. For the shortcut to the Rosses is the way to Fairyland. So one of the favourite things the fairies would do is that they put the Dalla Moog on you, and there's no adequate English translation for Dalla Moog. If you were to try to explain it in English, it would be to put the Dalla Moog on somebody is to radically disorient them, so they didn't know whether they were coming or they were going, or who they were, what they were about. So when they put the Dalla Moog on you, you had no idea where you were. Now, my mother told me this story. It happened to her as a little 6-year-old child when she was with her father, who was my grandfather, Daddy Jim. Now, they lived in Blarney, which is about 6 or 7 miles outside Cork City, but this was in the 1930s. And there was only one bus came through Blarney one day a week into Cork. Cork was a big city. At that stage, even, it was about 100,000 people. And Blarney was this tiny little place. So the bus would come through Blarney at 8 o'clock on the Saturday morning, and if anybody wanted to go into Cork, they'd get aboard that bus, and then the bus would leave the Bus Áras, a big bus station inside the Grand Parade, inside the Camden Quay in Cork, at 6 p.m. in the evening. So people would wait if they wanted to do their shopping. So it was my mother's very first trip to Cork City. It was a big, big deal. 8 miles was a lot of travelling in Ireland. But my grandfather had been in there many times. So he brings her on this trip, and they get the Blarney bus, leaving Blarney at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they come in and they spend the whole day wandering around Cork and buying little bits and pieces. And then it came to about 5:30 in the evening, when they should be heading for the Bus Áras. And all of a sudden, didn't the fairies put the Dalla Moog on my grandfather? Now this has nothing got to do with the fact that he spent the previous hour drinking Murphy's stout. That's a vicious rumor. It's not true. We didn't drink Guinness in Cork, we drank Murphy's. Guinness was a foreign drink invented in Dublin, so we drank Murphy's stout. So he spent the hour before drinking Murphy's stout, but that had nothing got to do with it. The fairies, for whatever reason, decided to put the Dalla Moog on him. So he is totally disoriented. He has no idea where he is. And he's wandering around the little streets of Cork, and my mother is panicking because the bus is going to leave at 6 o'clock, and she has no idea where it is, what's going to happen. Her mother is going to be distraught, and she's really tugging and saying, can't you find where we're going? I have no idea who this child is. And then he suddenly remembered. There's an antidote to the Dalla Moog. And what you have to do is, you have to take off your jacket and turn it inside out and wear it inside out. Now the jackets in those times, they weren't like the jackets we're wearing now. If you turn a modern jacket inside out, you'd hardly notice the difference. In the 1930s and 40s, if you turned the jacket inside out, there was big, big puffy sleeves, white kind of cotton, there was big, big tufted shoulders here. So it was very obvious if you were wearing your jacket inside out. But my grandfather turned it inside out, buttoned it up on the inside again, and all of a sudden, he has his bearings. And they head off with the Bus Áras, but he keeps it inside out just in case, around on the hot one, just in case something else, they come back for a second shot. And he wore it home on the bus all the way home to Blarney, and then they had 2 miles to walk from where the bus left them off until they knocked at the door and came in to my grandmother. And my grandmother took one look at her, and she said, "You bloody Ramadan, what are you doing with your jacket on inside out?" So he had to explain the situation to her, and then she understood. So that's what the fairies will do. You're really careful. There was a practice in Ireland, even when I was growing up, when it came time to harvest, particularly the hay, but even sometimes the barley or the wheat, when it came to the time to harvest, the hay was typically harvested in June and July. An individual farmer would go out and harvest his own hay. They'd gather together in groups. A group of about 10 local farmers would come together, and they'd come for 2 or 3 days to my place, and they'd harvest my crops. And then we'd all go to your place, and we'd harvest your crops, and then we went to a third location, until we did the runs and the 10 of us. And the women folk would be responsible for feeding all of us during that. They'd have to feed everybody during this period of time. And the word in Irish for that arrangement is called a mehel. And the mehel was this group of people who got together to help each other with the harvesting. So my grandfather is a young man, so he was born in 1882, so he's in his late teens, maybe just 1901, 1902, and he's attending this mehel out in Blarney. And on the first day of the mehel, when it came to lunchtime, the women had prepared all the food, and they bring it out and tables outside, and the men sit down to eat. There was hairy bacon and cabbage and beautiful floury potatoes bursting out their skins, smiling up at you, with big lumps of butter on top of them, and a big tankard of buttermilk. And lovely, great stuff. So she pushed the food down in front of them, and they say grace before meat, and they start beginning. And they take a bite of the bacon, and everybody starts spitting out immediately. I said, what in God's name is that happening here? It was the saltiest bacon they'd ever tasted. It was like you took a fistful of salt and just tried to swallow it. So nobody could taste it. So the man in the house is really, really embarrassed. He can't believe that his wife is after making a mebs of the dinner on him. He's really, really embarrassed. So he goes and he said, "Yeah, my God, woman, what are you after doing to the bacon?" And she said, "What's wrong with the bacon?" He said, "Take a taste of it." So she takes a piece of the bacon, puts it on, and spits it right out. She said, "Lord God Almighty, I'm cooking bacon since I was a little girl, and this has never happened. I am really, 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 would you apologise to the men for me?" So he goes out and says, "Guys, I'm really sorry. Would you make do with the spuds and the cabbage and sort the situation out tomorrow?" They're all very understanding. So come to tomorrow, they're continuing with the mehel, and they're harvesting some more. And it came to lunchtime again, and it was hairy bacon and cabbage and floury spuds and a big knob of butter on top of it and a jug of buttermilk. And they dig into the hairy bacon and declare to God Almighty, it's twice as bad as it was yesterday. Everybody's spitting in. And now the man in the house is really, really, really embarrassed. And the woman doesn't know where to hide herself. All of a sudden, there's this old man who's part of the mehel. And he goes up to him and he says, "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, "do you mind answering me a personal question?" She said, "Not at all, sir." He said, "Is there a young child in the house?" And she said, "There is." "How old is the child?" "He's about 5 months old now." "Has he changed anywhere in the last few months?" And the mother says, "Well, no," she says, "it's true for you. He was the sweetest little child. He would smile up at me non-stop. About 2 months ago, there was this real change came over him, and he's the crankiest. He's full of crites and cranky and colicky. He won't take the breast, he won't sleep at night, and he's shouting non-stop. No matter what I do, I can't soothe him." And the man says, "Well, what's wrong here?" He says, "Do you mind, ma'am," he says, "if when you're baking the grub tomorrow, if I hide myself in the kitchen?" She said, "Sure." So the next day comes and they're continuing to make the hay. And she starts the cooking. And she had a big iron range. They were very, very popular in Ireland, my child. Big iron stoves. And you'd feed lots of turf into them. And they'd get a red hot. And she has a big pot for the spuds, and she has a pot for the cabbage, and she got a pot for the bacon. And the little child is in a crib in the kitchen. And the old man creeps into the kitchen and hides behind the kitchen door. And the mother is busy with her business. And she takes the big hunk of bacon and puts it into totally fresh water and puts it on top of the stove. And goes out in the kitchen to do something else. And if she did, you know what happened? Up jumps the little child, 5 months child, out of the crib, across the floor, gets a stool for himself, and starts standing on top of it with 2 big fistfuls of salt and throw it right out. The guy, if he did, the old man is watching him. And he came out and he called him and he says, "I know what's happened." He said, "Call in your husband." So the husband was summoned, and all the crowd came in when they saw the husband going. And they were crowded around the side of the kitchen. And the old man said, "It isn't the child you have at all, it's a shiafra." And Mary's talked about it already. There was a custom, the fairies occasionally needed to steal a human baby to kind of crossbreed themselves. Sometimes they take an adult, like the woman she sang about, but sometimes it'd be a little baby, and they'd put a look-alike, and we could change it. And an Irish word we had for that was a shiafra. And it was one of the worst insults somebody could say to you, "Oh, you little shiafra, you." And so the old man says, "It isn't your child at all, man." He explained what he saw the child doing. He says, "There's a shiafra." He says, "This is going to be very painful now, but there's only one way to deal with this situation. So if you're kind of weak stomach, leave the kitchen out." But they were all fascinated. So he goes over to the crib. He lifted the child up out of it, and the child is screaming and yelling his head off already. He brings him across, right over to the red hot stove. And everybody said, "Holy God Almighty, what's he going to do with the child?" And he clapped the child right down into the rest. And the child is screaming his head off. And there's sizzling flesh and there's smoke. All of a a sudden the child is gone. And they're watching, and there's this tiny little whimper. And they look over, and there on the side, in the bassinet, is the original little baby smiling up. I suppose any storytelling would be complete if there were a few ghost stories, you know. So I'm the eldest of 6 kids. I have 3 sisters and 2 brothers. And one of my sisters is called Deirdre, one is called Ethna, and one is called Derva. So Deirdre, when she was a teenager, was, as we say in Ireland, doing a line with a boy. I called Welsh. And they never got married because at age 19 she wanted to become a nurse and she couldn't get a position in Ireland nursing, so she had to go to England. So she left her boyfriend, David Walsh, and went off to England. Picked up with an Englishman, married an Englishman. It took us a long, long time for us to forgive her. But in the meantime, we become friends with David Walsh's family. And in particular, I knew his father, Paddy Walsh, very, very well. And in the early 1960s, Paddy Walsh's mother, who was at that stage in her late 80s, took a bad turn and was, it was obvious she wasn't going to last very long. So they sent messages to all the kids to come home because their mother wasn't going to last. So on a Sunday evening, Paddy Walsh, whom I knew, who lived in one part of Cork City, walked across the city to visit with his dying mother. And he turns onto the street where they live, it's a long, long street, and he sees this Franciscan priest walking about 100 yards ahead of him. It's actually a Capuchin. There were 2 different groups of Franciscans living in Cork City. There were the OFMs, the ordinary Franciscans, and then there were the Capuchins, which was a kind of a reform group. And he could see by the rig out that this was a Capuchin. And he's walking about 100 yards ahead of him, and Paddy's walking behind him, and all of a sudden the priest turns in the driveway into Paddy's house. So Paddy said, oh my God, he's gone up to an eye, my mother. And he turned in after him, and the door opened, and the priest went in, and there was a stairway up to the left going up to the mother's bedroom. And the priest just went straight up. So Paddy came in after him and went into the kitchen. And his sister's in the kitchen, and they're talking for a few minutes, and his sister says to him, aren't you going to go upstairs to see Mama? And he says, I'll wait till the priest is finished. And she said, what do you mean wait till the priest is finished? He said, as I was coming up the street, there was a Capuchin priest coming up in front of me. He turned in the door and straight up the stairs. So he's above now, my mother's side. I wait till he's on, and I go. So they walked up the stairs into the bedroom. And Paddy says to her, Mama, was there a priest in here with you a few minutes ago? And she said, there was. Padre Pio. She had a great devotion to this Capuchin saint who lived in Italy at the time, who had the power of bilocation. And she wanted Padre Pio to be around her when she was dying, and she got her wish. The Catholic Church borrowed or stole or hijacked, whichever word you want to use, Samhain from the Celts. It was the great feast of All Hallows, the 31st of October, 1st of November, and it was a special time in Ireland. In Ireland, you've heard me use the phrase many times. We have this phrase, it's a thin place, a place between where the veil between the mystical and the mundane is diaphanous. And in the Celtic calendar as well, there were thin times. There were times in the year when the veil between the secular and the sacred were temporarily opened up. And there were 4 great feasts, particularly for the Celts, where that was true. One of them was Imbolc, which was the 1st of February. And the second was Bealtaine, which was the 1st of May. And the third was Lunasa, which was the 1st of August. And the fourth one was Samhain, which was the 1st of November. So the Catholic Church kind of hijacked all of these. And particularly, it hijacked Samhain and made it the feast of all saints and all souls. And if you grew up as Catholic, certainly in Ireland, in the 40s and 50s, there was a practice where on All Souls Day, if you went into a church and you prayed an Our Father, a Hail Mary, and a Glory be to the Father, for the Pope's intentions, you could string a soul out of purgatory. So as kids, we'd be running out all day, counting how many did you kind of set free this year. So people who were working, couldn't get in until late in the evening. So this was something that happened to my grandfather, Daddy Jim. He's coming home from work one day on All Souls Day, and it's in the evening time. This is November in Ireland. You know, the sun goes down about 4 o'clock in the evening. It's dark and it's wet and it's dismal. And he's coming home and he's passing the church in Blarney, and the door is still open, even though it's about 10 o'clock at night. So he decides he'll go in and see if he can set a few souls free. And he goes in and he sits down, and the steam is rising up because it's been lashing rain outside, and he gets kind of comfortable, and then he falls asleep. And after about an hour or so, the sacristan came around, and he couldn't see anybody in the church, so he locked up the church. So my grandfather was sleeping away, songs, whatever. And all of a sudden, on the stroke of midnight, something woke him up. And he looked up, and there was no electricity at that stage. This was being the 1930s. He looked up, and the sacristy door seemed to be open, and there was like the light of a candle shining out. And all of a sudden, he sees this old priest coming out with the chalice and the pall, walking out, you know, and putting the stuff up onto the altar, and lighting a candle, and then peering down into the dark church. And he came right down to the altar rails, and he said, "Is there anybody out there who could serve the Mass for me?" Because the priest can't say Mass on his own. That's why you have to have an altar server. The rule was you had to have a congregation, even if it was a congregation of one. So that was the origin of the acolyte. But he can't see anything, he's looking out. My grandfather wakes up, he puts up his hand, he says, "I'll serve you, Father." He goes right up to the altar, and at that stage Mass was said back to the people. So the priestess starts off, in Omni Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, in Proibo ad altare Dei. My grandfather says, and Dei quae rejuvenat tutum meam. So they start off with the Mass, they go right through the Mass, right up to the last Gospel and the last blessing. My grandfather's kneeling down. And the priest comes on to me and says, he says, "What's your name?" And my grandfather says to him, "My name is James Murphy, Father." But he says, "James Murphy, let me tell you a story. I'm dead 129 years. And before I died, somebody gave me a stipend to say Mass. And I forgot to say it. I can't be released from purgatory. And I've come back every single All Souls Day, and I visited all the churches in this area. And I almost never found anybody in the church, but on the few occasions when I did, as soon as I asked, they freaked and they ran. I'm the first person with the courage to answer my Mass. So I'll tell you this now, James Murphy, for nothing. When you come to die, I'll be there to escort you." And my grandfather died on the 4th of December 1956 in our house, upstairs in our house. And I'm certain of it, that the old priest turned up and said to him, "James Murphy, come on in, you're welcome." Around the time that Jesus was born, there was a band of warriors that lived in Ireland, and the name that they went by was the Fianna. And they were a very special elite group. In order to get into it, they had to be literally the crème de la crème. So the tests were as follows. They'd dig a pit in the ground so that the warrior could stand in waist high in the pit. The wannabe warrior. And he'd be given a shield, only a shield, no weapon. And 7 of the Fianna would attack him from all sides, and he'd have to turn around and defend him with the shield. And if they put a mark on his body, he wouldn't get it. They had to be storytellers and musicians. They had to be able to jump over a branch of a tree that was their own height. And they had to be able to run without slowing down under the branch of a tree that was the height of their knee. So it was a very stringent group to get into. And their function was to defend Ireland, particularly against Mary's people. Mary's name is MacLachlan. Can I spill the beans? Her name means MacLachlan, the son of the Vikings. Yeah? So the Vikings, you know, they attacked Ireland in waves on a regular basis. So the function of the Fianna was to defend Ireland against her forebears. And they were dedicated to the King of Ireland at the time. And when they weren't chasing Mary back to Scandinavia, they loved to hunt. They loved it. At that stage in Ireland, it was very heavily forested. And there was wild pig there, and there were big elks, and there was wolves there. So they loved to hunt. And they had these great big hunting dogs, you know, called the Irish Bullfrog, about this height. Huge big hunting dogs. But at one stage, there was a kind of a civil war between 2 clans of the Fianna, between a group called the Clan Morna and a group called the Clan Bashna. And the Clan Bashkina, the leader of that group was a guy called Cool. And he was actually the leader of the Fianna for a period of time. But when this civil war happened, Cool was murdered. A whole bunch of people were killed, and the Clan Morna came into the ascendancy. And they were hunting particularly Cool's wife, who was 7 months pregnant. And she escaped down to Tipperary, to a place called the Shield Bloom Mountains. And she gave birth to her little baby, a little fair-haired boy, so she called him Fionn. Fionn literally means fair. And she gave her baby away to 2 women warriors that they would raise him because she was afraid that she would continue to be hunted. And so these 2 women warriors, they raised the little boy and they taught him on the trade of being a warrior for the first 7 years. Then at the age of 7 years, they figured that he needed a male influence. So they decided to apprentice him to the greatest philosopher in Ireland at the time, a guy called Fergus. And Fergus was a philosopher who was regarded as the wisest man in Ireland at the time. But there was a wiser creature, and this was a salmon called Brodán Fassa. Brodán Fassa means literally the salmon of wisdom. And the Brodán Fassa lived in a lake over which 9 hazel trees dropped their nuts. And these were the nuts of wisdom. And any creature that ate them would acquire the wisdom. But they were so tough that only the gastric juices of this salmon could break them up. So this was the wisest creature in the world, and lived there for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the rumour was that if you could catch this salmon and eat it, you would acquire all its wisdom. So Finnegas had spent years and years and years trying to catch the salmon, no luck. And now the young Fionn, the 7-year-old, comes to apprentice himself to it. And I declare to God, on the very day that Fionn arrived, the salmon seemed just to surrender and give himself up. And Finnegas caught him. And so he skewered it, put it in a spit, and built a fire, and he's roasting the salmon. And he says to the young boy, he says, I'm jaded from the effort, he said. This is going to take 2 or 3 hours to cook. I'm going to take a sleep. Keep turning it so it doesn't get burned. And under no circumstances are you to eat any part of it. You hear me? The little boy said, yes, sir. So he lays down and he goes to sleep. And 3 or 4 hours later, the child pokes him and says, sir, it is done. And he wakes up and he has a look at the child. He says, you ate it. The little boy says, I ate what? He said, you ate the salmon. I didn't eat the salmon, not at all. He said, you did, I can see it in your eyes. You've acquired all the wisdom. You may as well take it now and eat the rest of it. And the child says, I didn't eat it all, but there was a blister came up in it, you know, and I pressed it with my thumb, and I burned my thumb, and I put my thumb in my mouth. And the man said, you can eat the rest of it now as far as I'm concerned, because you've received all the wisdom. And from that day on, Fionn got 2 gifts. One of the gifts was that if he cupped fresh water in his hands, and he brought to anybody who was ill, or any warrior who had been wounded in the battle, and he gave it from his own hands, the guy would cure like that. And the other was, whenever he wanted to prognosticate, he put his thumb in his mouth. So if you wonder what your little kids are doing, so Finn went on to become the leader of the Fianna in his own right some years later. And one day they loved to hunt. One day they're out hunting, and Finn had 2 very special dogs, 2 Irish wolfhounds. They were called Bran and Sciomán. In actual fact, these hounds had fairy blood in them themselves. They weren't totally canine, and they weren't totally human dogs. They were, they had fairy blood in them. And so one day they're out hunting. It's the end of the day, and everybody's getting tired, and they really want to go home. Finn lived in a place called Allen, the hill of Allen. And they're heading towards home, and all of a sudden the dogs, find something and they run after it, and it's a deer, a little fawn, and it's running in front of them. And the strangest thing happened. Fionn's 2 dogs started snarling at the other Irish wolfhounds, like backing them off. And they went side by side beside this little deer, like they were escorting her back to Finn's fort. And they trotted beside her, and she seemed to want to go there. So it's the strangest thing they've ever seen in their lives. And they came to the fort, and the little deer just ran through, and the dogs escorted her, and she sat under the table with the dogs during the meal, and it was perfectly at home and being guarded by them. So everybody thought this was the strangest thing they ever came across in their lives. A deer that seemed to want to be hanging around human beings. So the meal ended, and they all went off to bed for the night. In the middle of the night, all of a sudden there's this full yellow moon shining in through Finn's bedroom, and he wakes up with a start, and there's the most beautiful looking woman he's ever seen in his life. She had hair so fair that even the moonlight couldn't wash the gold out of it. And she's standing at the side of the bed. He said, "Oh my God, I died and went to heaven." "Who are you?" And she said, "I'm a woman of the She. I'm a woman of the fairy host. My name is Lady Sive. And I lived, under the mountains for many, many years, very, very happy. And then this evil druid came and wanted to marry me, and I wouldn't marry him. And he tried and tried and tried and tried, and I refused completely. And finally, he took out his magic hazel wand, and he put a spell on me, and he turned me into a deer by day. But at night, I come back to my feminine form." She said, "I found out that if I could gain access to the fort of Fionn McCool, I would regain my shape. And that's who I am." So they fell madly in love, absolutely madly in love. Finn didn't want to be out of her sight, so he stopped even hunting. He didn't want to leave his fort. He was so enamored of this lady's sight. But I declare to God, Mary and her group came back in their ships, and he took them off and sent them back to Scandinavia. So he warned Sive. He said, "Under no circumstances are you to leave the fort while I'm away. Under no circumstances. I'll be back hopefully 6 or 7 days' time. Stay where you are." And so he goes off, and they're fighting with the Lochlannig, and they're driving back into their ships, and they go back to Scandinavia, and Finn is coming back home as fast as he can. And as he reaches the fort, he's looking up to the ramparts where Lady Sive should be waiting, and waving at him, and there's no sign of her. And he gains access to the fort, and everybody has their eyes downcast. They know something is wrong. He said, "Where's Lady Sive? Why wasn't she out to greet me?" And they said, "Finn, something terrible has happened. About 3 days ago, this warrior came across the green with 2 dogs that looked exactly like Bran and Skjoldon, and he was the spitting image of you. And she thought it was you. And she ran out the gate, and we tried to grab her, and we couldn't. She ran out, helter-skelter, to be with you." And all of a sudden, just as he approached, he takes a wand, and he strikes her, and he turned her back into a deer. And no matter how hard she tried to go backwards, she couldn't turn. And we rushed out to rescue her, and all of a sudden, complete darkness fell over the earth, and we couldn't literally see her left hand. And when the light came again, there was no sign of her. We hadn't seen her for 4 or 5 days. And Finn was totally distraught. He searched the length and the breadth of Ireland, in the likely places and the unlikely places, and never found hide nor hair of her. So he went into mourning. He didn't even go out hunting. And 7 long years passed, and they said to him, "You have to go back. You have a life to live. You have to go back hunting, and you have to, come out of it." So he agreed to go back out hunting. On the very first day they're hunting, didn't his dogs go into this furze bush, and they're racing to the side there, and they're snarling, and the other dogs are trying to approach, and Bran and Skjoldon turn outside again, and they're snarling at the dogs. And Finn goes in, and there's this little child, about 7 years of age, totally naked, a little boy child, just standing there, absolutely fearless, with these dogs, around him, and Bran and Skjoldon defending him. And Finn comes up and says, "Who are you, child?" And the little boy doesn't have human language. He can't understand, and he can't speak to him. But he's happy to go back with them. So they bring him back to the Hill of Allen, and slowly by slowly, over the intervening months, he's beginning to pick up human speech. And then he tells them what the story was. He says, "As long as I can remember, I've never met any human beings. I've never been around human beings. There was only this deer that fed me and nurtured me and brought me food, and we lived together as long as I've been alive. And then about 4 or 5 days ago, this cruel-looking, wicked creature came, and he put a spell on her, and she went away with him. She was trying to come back, and she couldn't. And I've been alone for the last 4 days." Finn realised it was his own son. And so the name he gave him was Oisin, which in Irish means the little deer. Yeah. We're running out of time, so I'm going to shift modalities for a few minutes. When I lived in Africa, the belief system was that not the wisest creature, but the most cunning creature on the planet was the rabbit. We call it in Swahili, Kaka Sungura. And I'm convinced that that's where the southern part of this country gets the notion of brer rabbit. Kaka Sungura literally means brother rabbit in Swahili.
So in the Swahili tradition, Kakasumbura, the rabbit, is the most cunning of creatures. In Ireland it's different. In Ireland, the wisest creature was the salmon, but the most cunning creature was the fox. So there are lots of stories in Ireland about the cunning of the fox. So this was a story I heard from my grandfather. My grandfather, as I say, lived out in Blarney. And there's a little river that flows through Blarney, it's called the Shawnach. Now my grandfather he was a real dapper character, he was about 6'1", very straight, he was a great Irish step dancer. He would always wear a buttonhole, no matter what time of the year it was, even if it was just daisies, always a buttonhole. And he used to make his own walking sticks, blackthorn sticks. He'd make his own walking stick, and he'd always wear a cap. And he smoked a pipe. So one day, he's sitting at the bank of the Shawnach, just thinking his thoughts, philosophizing himself. And all of a sudden, he sees a fox at the other bank coming down the river. And he says, and he started to behave in the most extraordinary of fashions. All of a sudden, he goes over to this big clump of grass, and he takes a big clump of grass into his mouth, and he started backing into the Shawnach. His tail stuck up in front of him, he was backing in slowly by slowly, by slowly by slowly. So the water's coming up on his tail, and then it's coming up on his legs, and then it's coming up on his backside, and up his back, and then up his front legs, and then his shoulders, his head, and his snout, until finally, there's only his snout over the water. And then he went right down, and he left the clump of grass after him. See that? So it's a very slowly flowing stream. So the stream flows on, and my grandfather just puts in his walking stick and fishes out the lump of grass. And he begins to tease this under, and there's about 10,000 fleas on it. The fox was de-fleeing himself. And the fox realized that if he just went into the water, he wouldn't draw the fleas because there'd be air pockets, under his hair. So he backed in so slowly that the fleas could feel the water, and they started emigrating up his tail, up his hindquarters, up his back, up his shoulders, up his head, up his snout, and finally there was only the clump of grass left, and they got on top of that. And my father, grandfather, all of a sudden he started scratching himself. He was infested with fleas, infested with fleas. So I said to him, Daddy Jim, what did you do? He said, what could I do? Only what the fox did. He started walking into the river, slowly by slowly, slowly by slowly. With his cap on him, until finally there was only the cap, and he went, and let the cap float down. I don't know where it landed up, but I have a sneaky suspicion that over the course of 30 or 40 years, it floated across the Atlantic, down the south coast of America, down the Cape Horn, up the west coast, landed in California, and some poor English shore saw it and picked it up and put it on his head and started walking into towards Atherton. And that's why we have a place called Alameda de las Palmas. Let me finish up with one story for you. There was a man living in Blarney called Jack Murphy. He was a third cousin of my grandfather's. And Jack was an only child. His father had died when he was a young boy, and so his mother was widowed. And he was a very, very, very nice creature, very mild-mannered young man. He only had one vice. He loved playing cards. And in my part of the country, particularly, the cards that we played was called 45. So he loved playing cards, and he loved playing cards for money. And they lived out in the woods. There was a very wooded area around Blarney. And his mother would be really fearful of him coming home really, really late at night after a card game. And she didn't want him to be doing it, but he was addicted to card playing. So one day he's gone out the door, and she said, in the name of God, Jack, she said, why are you going out playing cards? It's dark, night like this. He said, Josh, I won't be that long, I'll be home early. She said, will you make me a promise, Ron? Will you come home before 11 o'clock? And he said, I will. I'll make you a promise I'll be home for you before 11 o'clock. So he goes about 2 or 3 miles across the fields to a neighbour's place, and they played 45, and he's not doing too well. And then about 10:30, he started winning. And he said, my God, I'm on a roll, I have to stay with this. And he won 2 or 3 or 4 games. And all of a sudden, the grandfather clock in the house strike 12. Vadav Nahia, the dead middle of the night. And he jumps off the table and he starts running for home. And it's pitch dark at this stage, and he's tumbling over ditches and into water and everything else. And he jumps over this big ditch, and he lands in the field, and all of a sudden, straight up against somebody. The biggest, ugliest giant he'd ever encountered in his whole life. And the Jack said to him, Hello, Jack. Are you playing cards? And Jack says, I was. Are you good at the cards, Jack? How do you look like? Do you want to play cards with me, Jack? What choice have you got? If you meet a big ugly giant and he says, will you play cards with me, what will you say? No. They know each other. So the big ugly giant says to him, he says, whoever wins can name their own price. And we play 7 games. And whoever wins the most of the 7, they can name their price. So they settle down and the moon is coming out and they can barely see the cards. And they play the first game of cards and Jack wins it. Maybe this isn't too bad after all. And they play the second game of cards and Jack wins it. God, he's getting confidence in himself now. And they win the third game of cards and Jack wins it. We're on a roll here, lads. They play the fourth game of cards and Jack is just about to win and the big giant throws down the 5 of hearts on top of it. The best card in the deck. So it's 3-1. And they play the 5th game of cards and the big ugly giant wins that. It's 3-2. And they play number 6 and the big ugly giant wins that and it's now 3-3. And they play the last game of cards. Who do you think won it? You heard the story before, huh? The big ugly giant. And he says, Jack, come with me now. I have a plan for you. And all of a sudden I see this big stallion in the shadows and they climb up on top of its back and they start racing from Blarney out through Macroom, down through Dingle, out along the Dingle Peninsula, down to Dunqueen, and they jump off into the waves. And the horse is able to travel in the waves as easily as able to travel on the land. And they gallop and they gallop and they gallop and they gallop until the sun comes up behind them and sinks in front of them and they're still galloping. And up comes the sun a second time and sinks in front of them a third day. And finally, right in the middle of the Atlantic, they land in the evening time on this little island. In the middle of the island is a big double-storey house, not looking very appetizing. And the giant takes him in, up the stairs, along this corridor, and opens up this door, and pushes him into the room and says, I'll be back for you tomorrow morning. Locks the door behind him. So Jack is trying to get across into the dark, and there's this sticky stuff on the floor, he can't wonder what's that sticky stuff. And there's a bed in the middle of the room. And the side is just slowly, looks up, and all around the perimeter of the wall are these heads looking down. Dripping blood. There's only one space with a big nail sticking out of it. So he's absolutely scared. So he kneels down at the side of the bed and he says, pray, angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love can rest me here. And with his night be at my side, to light and guard, to rule and guide him. He's praying all night long. So dawn breaks and the door opens and the big ugly giant comes in with breakfast. A tray with a mug of cold water and a slice of hard bread. But he eats it down, swallows it down sweet. So the big giant takes him outside and he says, I have a job for you. And he brings him to the biggest shkibol, stable he's ever seen in his life, much bigger than this room. And he said, this stable hasn't been cleaned out for 700 years. I'm going away now. I'll be back when the sun goes down. And if this shkibol, if this stable isn't spick and span, you'll have your head. So Jack just tries to do it. So he takes off his jacket and he finds a shovel. He takes a shovel full of manure and throws it out through the front door. And all of a sudden, 7 shovels come back in. And he runs out the secret. Goes with that, there's nobody outside. I'm dreaming it, I'm hallucinating. So he takes a shovel again and he digs it in. He throws it out through the door and immediately 7 more shovels come in. So the harder he works, the dirtier the place gets. So it comes about 5:30 in the evening and he's totally distraught. And all of a sudden, he sees this fairy princess walking towards him. And Jack says, my God, am I glad to see you. And he tells her, give us a hand. And she says, what's the problem? And he explained the predicament to her. So she's wearing this little brooch, and she takes the brooch, she throws it in, and she says, Shluk Schlachter, or Shluk for Schlachter. She says, go on, start working now. So he takes a shovel full of manure and throws it out, and immediately 1,000 shovels of manure go out after it. I can't believe it. He digs it again, one more shovel, throws it out, 1,000 more shovels. And by the stroke of 6 o'clock, the place was spick and span. You could eat your lunch off it. He goes back out, he's outside the door, and just then the sun goes down, and who comes with the big, ugly giant. He says to Jack, did you clean out the ski ball? And Jack says, I did. You did not? Jack says, I did. He said, you did not. Nobody has ever managed that in 700 years. Don't be telling me lies. So Jack says, come and have a look. So they go inside, places spick and span. So Jack is delighted. So he says, can I go home to my mother now? And the big ugly giant says, no, he says, I have another task for you tomorrow morning. He drags him into the house, up the stairs, down the corridor, shows him into the room. At this stage now, the sticky stuff is up to about here. The bed is floating around in the middle of it. And there's this one spike still waiting for him. So he covers his head, and he's all night long praying. And the dawn breaks, and the big ugly giant comes in, opens the door with his breakfast. What did he get him? A tray. There was no stale bread the second time, Mary. There was only water. A drink of water. That was it. Breakfast, a drink of water. But he drank it down sweet. And out he went, and the big ugly giant says to him, he brought to this huge big field, the biggest field he'd ever seen in his life. It's about a mile square. And this beautiful white stallion is way on the other side of the field. And the big ugly guy said, you see that horse over there? That horse hasn't been caught for 700 years. I'm going away now. He'll be back at sunset, 6 o'clock this evening. And if that horse isn't tied up inside the ski ball, so Jack didn't know what he was going to do. So he found a base in the wall someplace, and he found a rope, and he walked across the field as slowly as he could. And he put the base of the wall down in front of the horse, and the horse came over and stuck his nose inside it, and Jack started creeping up and started putting the rope around his neck. But as soon as the horse felt the rope, he scattered away across the other side of the field, because that's a mile across. So poor Jack takes up his basin and his rope and schleps it across. Schlep, is that an Irish word? No, it isn't. Across the field. Puts the base of the nose down in front of the horse thing, and the horse comes over and sticks his nose into it. And Jack is trying to put the rope around him, and as soon as the horse feels the rope, he scatters again. So he spends the whole day crisscrossing the field, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. But it came at about 5:30. He sat down and he started to cry. He was bad. And all of a sudden, who turned up? The fairy princess. And she says, what's the problem, Jack? So he explained to her the nature of the predicament. And she was wearing this beautiful white silk scarf. And she took off the scarf and she said, no, instead of a rope, use this. So he runs across the field as fast as he can go at the base of the walls, puts it in front of the horse, and the horse comes over, sticks his nose in it, and Jack starts putting this silk scarf around his neck. And the horse tries to pull, but he'll declare to God if he's not stuck to the ground. He can't move a leg. So Jack has this silk scarf, picks up the basin, leads him across the field, into the ski bowl, and ties him up inside him. And just then, the sun goes down, and who comes back? Jack. He says to Jack, did you catch the horse? And Jack said, I did. Don't be telling me lies, you little loser on you. You didn't catch him, nobody's ever caught him in 700 years. Jack says, come into the ski bowl and have a look for yourself. So they go in, and there's the horse tied up. And the big ugly giant is fuming at this thing. And Jack says to him, can I go home now? And the big ugly giant says, no, you have one more task to do tomorrow. And if you do that, I'll set you free. So up the stairs with him inside the house, along the corridor, into the room. At this stage, the stuff is up there. He's swimming around inside the room. And the next morning, the big ugly giant comes with his breakfast, a tray, and what's on it? Nothing. Zero. Absolutely nothing. He drags him out, and they come to a different part of the property, and there's a lake on the property. And in the middle of the lake, there's a little island, and in the middle of the island, there's the biggest tree Jack had ever seen in his life. So tall that the head was stuck into the clouds. And in fact, it was stuck into the clouds above the clouds, not just the ordinary clouds, but the ones above them. And the big ugly giant says to him, on the top of that tree, there's a nest. And there's 3 golden eggs in that nest. And I've been looking for them for 700 years, and I can't get up there. When I come home at 6 o'clock this evening, if you haven't those golden eggs in the helio fished, that'll be it for you. So poor old Jack, he took off his shirt, rolled up his toes and legs, and dived into the lake and swam across. He was a handy swimmer. Swam across, dragged himself onto the lake, and started climbing up the tree. But within 15 feet or so, the branch broke, and he came crashing down, and he banged his head, and he's concussed. When he comes to after about 10 minutes, his eyes are swimming. He goes down to the water and splashes some water in his face, and tries again. And he gets about 25 feet this time, and the branch broke, and down he comes. So he spends the whole day climbing, and the branch is breaking. Comes to 5:30, he's knackered. That's it. He sits down, he begins to pay, never see his mother. And who came along? And she says to Jack, what's the nature of your predicament? And he explained the conundrum to her. And she was wearing this other little brooch. And she took it off and she said, Schluck Schlachter or Schluck vor Schlachter. And she said, no, it was in the form of a little ladder. And she put it down there, and I declared to God, then the ladder started growing up along the side of the tree, up into the clouds, they couldn't see the top of it. And she said to him, no, listen very carefully. You have to step on every single rung of this ladder, all the way up, and all the way back down. Like, listen to me. He said, yeah. So he starts climbing this 5:30 the stage. He's galloping up as fast as he can go, right up through the clouds. He can't see where he's going, then there's a space between him, into more clouds. He goes up above those, and you can see the very tip top of the tree, and he's on the very, very tip rope, and he's reaching up, and there's a nest up there. He puts his hand in, 3 golden eggs. He can't believe his luck. So he wraps them up in his handkerchief, and sticks it in his pocket, and starts galloping down as fast as he can go. Down fast. And he's 3 rows from the bottom, and he jumps off. And she said to him, now look what you did. He said, what do you mean what I did? He said, I had the 3 golden eggs. She said, you don't? He said, I do, look. Takes them out. There's nothing left in the handkerchief. So he's absolutely distraught after all that effort. So he said, oh my God, I blew it. What am I going to do? She said, this is going to seem very, very strange now. She said, but have you a penknife on you? He said, I have. She put her fingers on the block of wood like that. She said, you're going to have to cut off my 3 fingers. He said, I can't do that. You've saved my life already 3 times. She said, I'm trapped here like you are, and the only way out is if you cut off my 3 fingers. She can't believe it. So she puts her fingers down on the block of wood. He closes his eyes and he cuts through the 3 fingers. And what do you think happened? Then the 3 fingers turned out 3 golden eggs. And she puts her hand behind her back and she says, Schluck Schlachter, Schluck vor Schlachter. She raises her hand, there's brand going in. So Jack says, yes, we're out of here. We'll give him his eggs and we'll go. She says, no, we won't. He's been looking for those eggs for 700 years and he wasn't able to get them. As soon as he gets them, he'll kill you and he'll kill me. I've been in prison here for 700 years as well. So Jack said, what are we going to do? She said, I'll tell you what we're going to do. The horse that we captured yesterday, we're going to ride it out of here. So they go back to the Shigabol, and they saddle the horse and trunk it up, and they gallop to the end of the island, and the horse is able to go all the way. And they're galloping, and they're galloping all night, and the sun comes up in front of them and sets down behind them. And she says to him, look behind you and tell me if you see anything. He looks behind. He says, there's like this tiny little cloud on the horizon. She says, go faster. They're galloping. The sun comes up in front of them again, crosses the sky, and goes down behind them. She says, look behind you, can you see anything? I declare to God, isn't the big giant up on his horse, and he's gathering, he's coming. So she said, okay, I want you to put your hand into the horse's right ear, and you'll find a little spike of steel, and throw it over your right shoulder. So she puts her hand into the horse's right ear, and there's a little spike of steel, and she throws it behind her. All of a sudden, these steel spikes go up from the bottom of the ocean to about this height below the surface of the water. And then the big ugly giant's horse put his foot down right on top of one of them, went right through it, and threw the rider, and the horse fell over, the rider fell over, and one of them went straight through his heart. And if you ever come across a big ugly giant, the only way to kill him is through the heart. Remember that? Yeah? That's very important information, keep that. And they killed him dead. So they rode to Alec, landed in Dulchain, came along with the Dingle Peninsula, up through Macroom, heading towards Blarney. And at this stage, of course, Jack is madly in love with her. So he says, will you marry me? And she says, I will. And again, like Mary told us, a year and a day is the magic number. So she said, I have to go, do my business, but I'll be back. So I have to tell you this, under no circumstances are you to kiss anybody. If you do, you'll forget completely about me. Jack says, great. So she goes off with the white horse, and he schleps it across to Blarney, and in the front door, he says, deliver God Almighty, child. Where were you for the last week? And he says, well, you won't believe the adventures I'm after having. So she runs over to give him a big kiss. He says, no, I can't kiss you at all. If I kiss you, I forget about the fairy princess. And she said, what fairy princess? He said, I'll tell you all about your own thing. I had the most extraordinary adventure. And just then this dog went in. And he was delighted to see him. The dog jumped up, and he went down, pat the dog, and the dog kissed him. And the mother said, tell me, where were you? Who's this fairy princess? And Jack says, what's up with you, woman? She said, where were you for the last week? And Jack says, me? I was here for the last week. She says, are you losing your mind? What about this fairy princess you've been talking about? Jack says, in the name of God, now you went demented on me. Fairy princess? I don't know any fairy princess. So gone completely. So he goes back to his work, and one day he's digging out in the garden, he's digging stuff, and his mother calls him for the dinner. And he just sticks his fork in the ground, and he hears this metallic click. He said, oh my God, what's that? So he goes, gets a shovel, he starts digging, and what did he found but a huge big chest of gold goblins that was put there in 1588 by the Spanish Armada. So he dug it up, he became the richest man in Ireland. He built a huge big house with a window for every day in the year and a skylight for the leap year. And everybody got to know him. All the kings of the world wanted him to marry their daughter, and all the princesses from all over Ireland. And they were coming flocking in, so he decided, I'll settle a date, and you can all come, and I'll take my choice of you. So they're gathering from all parts of the world for the day of the choosing. And everybody's there, very, very important people from all over the world. Presidents and princesses of all kinds. And all of a sudden, there's a knock at the back door. And there's this old bedroom with a big black shawl, and she's hobbling up to the back door. And the steward comes out and says, what do you want? She says, I want to entertain, he was now called him the king, King Jack. I want to entertain the king. The guy takes one look and says, what kind of entertainment could you offer anybody? And she said, let me in, let me very good entertainment. So we left her in anyway, and they bring her up, and the king is sitting, Jack is sitting on his dais up here, and everybody's sitting around, and this old woman comes up in front of him, and she has a big mala, and she takes a plate over the mala, and a saucer, and she puts the two down, and she says, Schluck Schlachter, Schluck Fortjachter. And all of a sudden, the sauce turned into a hen, and the plate turned into a rooster. Everybody's amazed at this. Oh my God. And she takes a fistful of grain and throws it in the ground, and the hen is walking across to eat the grain, and the rooster runs in front of her and gobbles it all up. And all of a sudden, the hen started to speak. Everybody's shocked. And the hen says to him, you didn't do that the time that I cleaned out the shitty bowl for you? And Jack wasn't doing this whole way. She takes out another fistful of grain, and she throws it on the ground, and the hen is walking across to eat it, and the rooster runs in front of her and gobbles it all up. And the hen spoke for a second time, and the hen said, you didn't do that the time that I captured the white horse for you. And Jack is, memories are beginning to tumble back, and where have I heard that voice before? Oh, why is that familiar, that story familiar to me? And she takes out a third fistful and throws them on the ground, and the same thing happens. The hen is going across to eat them, and the rooster runs in front of her and gobbles them all up, and the hen speaks for the third time. And the hen said, you didn't do that the time that I found the 3 golden eggs for you. And all of a sudden, he comes tumbling back into Jack's, and he jumps off the dais, runs down, and he whips the cloak off her. And who do you think it was?
Very princess.
You heard it before. And he told him then and there on the spot who she was, and he says to all the princesses, you can go home for yourselves, because there's not another woman in the world I'd marry except this one. And they got married, they lived happily ever after, and they had 6 children, and they had 19 grandchildren, and they had 11 great-grandchildren, and one of them, a guy called Porrick, was in my class in school. Of all the money that here I spent it all in good company. And of all the harm that ever I've done, alas, it was to none but me. And since it falls unto my lot that you should go, and I should not, come drink to me a parting glass. Good night, and God be with you all.